Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We are pulling back the velvet curtain on one of the most gilded, most doomed, and most genuinely tragic dynasties in human history, the Romanovs. And not the sparkly Anastasia cartoon version. I mean the real thing. The last royal family of Russia, teetering on the edge of the modern world with absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. A family so wealthy they had rooms dedicated to rooms, yet so completely out of touch, they thought letting millions of people go hungry was probably fine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I want to give a very sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You have impeccable taste in catastrophe, and this channel genuinely would not be the same without the people who take the time to send in ideas. It means more than you know. Leave me a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and somehow that is always here. The channel is also now on Spotify. By the way, link is in the description if you'd like to take tonight's disaster with you on a walk. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan, stretch out, pull the blanket up, and get very, very comfortable, because you are about to spend a lot of time in a palace, and ironically, that is not as relaxing as it sounds. But first, let's just pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a Romanov? To wake up every morning in a building so enormous you needed a guide just to find the dining room? To be so shielded from ordinary life that you genuinely believed your subjects adored you, right up until they very much did not? Could you have handled growing up in a palace where every room had a purpose, none of which was fun? What would it do to you to be told from birth that you were chosen by God to rule 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, and then discover, somewhere around age 40, that God may have had other plans? Would you have read the warning signs? Would you have made different choices? Or would you, like Nicholas, have simply gone to play tennis? Congratulations. You have just woken up in St. Petersburg, Russia. The year is 1917. The chandeliers are still lit, the silver is still polished, and absolutely everything is about to go wrong. Let's start at the beginning, or rather, let's start at the point where the beginning already contained several warning signs that everyone chose to ignore. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was born on the 6th of May, 1868, into a family that had ruled Russia for over 300 years, which sounds impressive until you realise that by the time Nicholas arrived, the dynasty was already held together largely by tradition, divine right theory, and an extremely firm belief that none of this could possibly end badly. He was the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III, a man so physically imposing he once straightened a bent iron bar with his bare hands, and so politically conservative he treated reform the way most people treat a wasp in the room, by simply refusing to acknowledge it and hoping it would go away. Alexander III had come to power in 1881 under the worst possible circumstances. His own father, Alexander II, had been assassinated by revolutionaries in the streets of St. Petersburg, blown apart by a bomb thrown by a member of a group called People's Will, which is a name that sounds quite reasonable until you consider that what the People's Will apparently demanded was exploding the Tsar. The effect on Alexander III was immediate and permanent. He became deeply suspicious of reform, deeply committed to autocracy, and deeply convinced that the answer to Russia's problems was more control, less debate, and absolutely no constitutions. He moved the court away from St. Petersburg to the fortified palace at Gatchina, surrounded himself with loyal security, and settled in to rule Russia the way his grandfather had ruled it, which is to say, as though the 19th century had not really happened. Into this world arrived young Nicholas, and the world he inherited from his father was one where the Tsar's word was law. The peasantry was enormous and largely illiterate. The Industrial Revolution was arriving late and chaotically in the cities, and the intellectual class was producing at an impressive rate pamphlets, novels, and political theories, several of which would eventually prove extremely inconvenient for everyone involved. Nicholas was educated by tutors, schooled in languages and history, given a military education, and taken on tours of the empire designed to show him the breadth and loyalty of his future subjects. He travelled to the Far East as a young man, and came within a sword stroke of an early death when a Japanese policeman attacked him during a visit to Otsu, an event that left him with a small scar on his forehead and a permanent wariness about Japan that would later, in the context of the Russo-Japanese War, feel almost prophetic. What nobody quite prepared Nicholas for was the actual work of ruling. The Romanov model of education produced men who understood that they were Tsar, understood the weight and dignity of the title, and understood almost nothing about the practical mechanics of managing a modernizing empire with a restless population and a creaking bureaucracy. There was no training in how to chair a cabinet meeting, no preparation for navigating between competing factions of ministers, no instruction manual for the moment your advisors tell you contradictory things and you have to decide which one is correct. You were the Tsar. You were chosen by God. Presumably God would handle the details. Alexander III died in October of 1894 at the age of 49 from kidney disease, somewhat rapidly as these things go, leaving his 26-year-old son standing at the edge of an empire with a look that people who were there described as something close to terror. Nicholas reportedly said to a cousin shortly after his father's death, "What is going to happen to me, to all of Russia? I'm not prepared to be a Tsar." He was not wrong. And the empire, 300 years old and fraying at every seam, was waiting. Nicholas's childhood was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinarily sheltered, which is a polite way of saying that nothing in his upbringing remotely prepared him for what was coming. He grew up in the vast marble corridors of the Winter Palace and the quieter, warmer rooms of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, a world of tutors, military exercises, and the steady, comforting message that Russia was great, the Romanovs were its rightful rulers, and the peasants were, on the whole, quite content. He was described by his tutors as a sweet boy, diligent but not particularly bold, more comfortable on horseback or in a rowboat than behind a desk of state papers, a preference that, as it turned out, would have consequences for everyone. The palaces themselves were extraordinary things. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg contained over 1,000 rooms, 1,700 windows, and enough square footage to ensure that you could, in theory, spend several days exploring it without revisiting the same corridor twice. It was staffed by an army of servants organised into a hierarchy so precise and so elaborate that there were people whose specific job was to hand objects to the people, whose job was to hand those objects to the Tsar, a system of human relay that said everything you needed to know about the Romanov court's relationship to the concept of efficiency. Tsarskoye Selo, the family's preferred residence, was somewhat cosier, meaning it had only a few hundred rooms and a park large enough to contain a small lake, several follies, and a Chinese village built by Catherine the Great, because Catherine the Great was that kind of person. In this world, Nicholas was a pleasant, somewhat passive child. He loved the outdoors, skating, bicycling, long walks through the palace grounds, and he loved his family with a quiet, steady warmth that everyone who knew him remarked upon. He was not cruel, not arrogant, not the kind of prince who terrorized servants or demanded impossible things. He was, by most accounts, a genuinely nice young man, and if he had been born into almost any other family in Europe, he would probably have lived a perfectly happy life as a minor royal, attending ceremonies, shooting pheasants, and going to bed at a reasonable hour without anyone's fate depending on his decisions. The problem was the gap between the world Nicholas was raised in and the world Russia actually was. His tutors taught him history, languages. He spoke English, German, French and Danish, and the principles of military organization. They did not teach him economics. They did not introduce him to poverty in any form that required him to engage with it as a real condition rather than a fact about other people. The closest Nicholas came to ordinary Russian life was during his military service, which was conducted in regiments composed of carefully selected aristocrats who were not, by any stretch, representative of the country their regiment was supposed to defend. He kept a diary from a young age, a habit he maintained for his entire life, and the diaries are, in their way, revealing documents, not because of what they contain, but because of what they do not. They record weather, meals, walks, games of tennis, and the comings and goings of family with meticulous, cheerful regularity. They contain very little anxiety, very little political analysis, very little evidence of a man who lay awake at night worrying about the direction of his country. Whether this reflects genuine equanimity, a deliberate decision to keep the diary as a private record separate from public affairs, or simply a failure to connect the dots between what he was reading in state reports and what it meant for real human beings living real lives, is a question historians have argued about for a long time without reaching agreement. What is not in question is that by the time Nicholas inherited the throne, he was a man whose emotional formation was entirely complete and whose political formation was, to put it gently, insufficient. He had the values of a loving father and the instincts of a country gentleman. He was about to govern an empire of 130 million people in a century that was going to demand rather more than that. Nicholas married Alexandra Feodorovna, born Princess Alex of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, in November of 1894, and the timing of the event was, to put it charitably, inauspicious. The wedding took place just days after the funeral of Alexander III, meaning the new Tsar and his bride essentially went from a burial to a banquet, with very little time in between to absorb the fact that Nicholas was now responsible for 130 million people. Alexandra arrived in Russia already unpopular with the Russian court, who had wanted Nicholas to marry someone less Germanic and more politically convenient, and she responded to this warm welcome by becoming progressively more withdrawn, more religious, and more convinced that the Russian aristocracy were largely terrible people, which, to be fair, many of them were. The courtship itself had been long and genuinely romantic, which was unusual enough in royal circles to attract comment. Nicholas had met Alex of Hesse when she was 12 and he was 16, at a family wedding in St. Petersburg, and had immediately and sincerely decided that she was the person he wanted to marry. He spent the next several years pursuing this ambition with a quiet persistence that nobody in his family quite knew how to argue with, partly because it was his only display of genuine stubbornness about anything, and partly because Alex was, by any reasonable standard, an excellent candidate, royal blood, intelligence, a serious disposition, and the kind of bone-deep moral seriousness that suggested she would not embarrass anyone at a state dinner. Alexander III and Empress Maria had reservations, mainly on the grounds that Hesse was a small duchy of limited political significance, but they eventually relented, largely because Nicholas showed no interest in marrying anyone else. Alex had her own reservations, which were spiritual rather than political. Converting to Russian Orthodoxy was required, and Alex was a devout Lutheran who took her faith with the same intensity she took everything. She agonized. She prayed. She wrote long, uncertain letters. And then she converted, took the Russian name Alexandra Fyodorovna, and arrived in Russia to marry the man who was now Tsar, accompanied by the silent observation of a court that had already decided it was not going to like her very much. The wedding was held on the 26th of November, 1894, in the Winter Palace, and it was conducted in the particular atmosphere of forced festivity that attends celebrations held in the immediate aftermath of death. Alexandra wore mourning jewellery. The church was full of people who were still formally in mourning for Alexander III. Nicholas moved through the ceremony with the expression of a man who was simultaneously deeply happy and acutely aware that the timing could have been better. Observers noted that the new Tsarina did not smile easily, did not circulate graciously among the court, and gave the impression of someone who found the entire proceeding somewhat overwhelming, an impression that became a permanent feature of her public persona, and one that the Russian court interpreted, uncharitably but not entirely unfairly, as coldness. Alexandra was not cold. She was shy, profoundly shy in the particular way of someone whose interior life is extremely rich, and whose ability to translate that interior life into small talk at imperial receptions is extremely limited. She loved Nicholas with an intensity that never diminished. She was funny in private, affectionate with her children, capable of deep friendship with a small number of people she trusted. But Russia did not see any of that. Russia saw a German princess who stood too stiffly at ceremonies, who had brought no obvious political advantage, and who, in the words of the Dowager Empress Maria, Nicholas's mother, who had been spectacularly good at the performance of royalty, simply did not know how to be a Tsarina. It was not a promising start, and in the business of dynasty, starts tend to set the tone for everything that follows. 2 years after the wedding in May of 1896, Nicholas and Alexandra were officially crowned Tsar and Tsarina of all Russia in Moscow, and what followed was one of those historical events that, in retrospect, sounds almost too on the nose to be real. The coronation festivities included a massive public celebration at Kudinka Field outside Moscow, where enormous crowds gathered to receive commemorative gifts from the new Tsar: mugs, sausages, small packages of sweets, the kind of thing you hand out when you want your subjects to feel seen. What organisers had not adequately planned for was the crowd itself, which numbered somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, pressing toward a field riddled with ditches and abandoned construction trenches. When a rumour spread that the gifts were running out, the crowd surged, and in the resulting crush, approximately 1,389 people were killed. The field itself was, in ordinary circumstances, used as a military training ground, which meant it was not flat open parkland but a landscape of uneven terrain, pits and gullies, the kind of surface that is survivable when you're navigating it slowly and in small numbers, and lethal when 500,000 people are simultaneously trying to move in the same direction, under the impression that the person ahead of them has a mug that you do not. The panic spread with the speed that panics always spread, which is instantly, and the people at the edges of the crowd had no way of knowing what was happening at the front, and the people at the front had no way of stopping what was happening behind them. By the time it was over, the field was covered in the dead and the injured, and the gifts, the mugs, the sausages, the small packages of sweets were still being distributed, because the distribution machinery had not received a message indicating that anything unusual had occurred. Nicholas was told. His response, or rather, the response of his advisers, to which he acquiesced, was the decision that historians have cited ever since as the moment the new reign made its first major error. He attended a ball that evening. The ball had been organised by the French ambassador, and cancelling it would have been a diplomatic incident, or so the argument went, and Nicholas and Alexandra appeared at it and danced, while the bodies of over 1,000 of his subjects were being collected from a field a few miles away. The reaction of Moscow and St. Petersburg to this decision was immediate and lasting. The Tsar who danced while his people died. It was an image that lodged in the public consciousness with the particular permanence of things that confirm what people were already beginning to suspect. To be fair to Nicholas, a phrase that appears with some frequency in his biography, and always in a slightly exhausted tone, he did visit the hospitals afterward. He did make donations to the families of victims, and he did express genuine distress in private correspondence about what had happened. He was not indifferent to the deaths. He was simply unable or unwilling to defy the social machinery of the court that had decided the ball must go on. This was the pattern that would define his reign: the private compassion, the public failure to act on it, the deference to convention, precedent, and the advice of people who confused the interests of the court with the interests of Russia. Khodynka was not an omen he caused, but it was an omen he had the opportunity to respond to with decisive visible humanity, and he did not. Russia was watching, and Russia remembered. Strip away the uniform, the medals, the weight of 300 years of dynasty, and what you find at the centre of Nicholas Romanov is a man who was, by almost every account, genuinely kind, deeply devoted to his family, moderately fond of tennis and long walks, and almost catastrophically unsuited to the job he'd been handed. He kept a diary throughout his life, an obsessive habit, and what leaps off those pages is not the voice of a calculating autocrat or a paranoid tyrant, but something more unsettling. A man who seemed perpetually surprised by events, as though history was something happening to him, rather than something he was shaping. On the day he received news of the Russian military's devastating defeat in Manchuria in 1904, his diary entry noted the military setback, and then recorded that he had gone for a pleasant walk and played dominoes in the evening. This is not the behaviour of a monster. It is arguably the behaviour of something more troubling for the purposes of ruling an empire, a man whose emotional equilibrium was so complete, so sealed off from external disturbance, that even catastrophe could not reach deep enough to change what he did at 8 o'clock in the evening. Nicholas was not stupid. He was well read, spoke multiple languages fluently, had a good memory for details, and was capable of considerable charm in one-on-one situations. He was also not lazy in the sense of refusing to work. He sat through long meetings, read state papers, signed documents, met with ministers. He was simply, and this is the maddening, tragic thing about him, unable to connect the information he received to the decisions it demanded, and unable to sustain a decision once it had been made if someone he trusted argued against it. His closest friends and ministers describe in their memoirs a quality in Nicholas that they found simultaneously appealing and infuriating. He agreed with whoever he had spoken to most recently. He would meet with a minister, hear the minister's argument, nod thoughtfully, indicate that he found the argument persuasive, and the minister would leave feeling that a decision had been made. The following day, Nicholas would meet with another minister holding the opposite view, nod thoughtfully again, and the first minister would discover that the decision he thought he had secured had been quietly unmade. This was not deliberate manipulation. There is no evidence that Nicholas was playing his advisers against each other for strategic reasons. It appears to have been genuine. He found it very difficult to disagree with people to their faces, very difficult to maintain a position under pressure, and very difficult to distinguish between good advice and bad advice, when both were delivered by men with impressive beards and confident voices. In private, the diaries and letters reveal a man of considerable warmth. He adored his children, played with them, rough-housed with them, tucked them in, called them by affectionate nicknames, and was visibly happiest when the family was together at Tsarskoye Selo with no ministers, no ceremonies, and no requirement to be the Tsar of all Russia before breakfast. He and Alexandra wrote each other letters of genuine tenderness, the kind of letters that, when historians quote them, provoke a slightly helpless feeling in the reader, because here, undeniably, was a man capable of love, warmth, and human feeling, and that man was also the man presiding over the slow, structural collapse of a society that would eventually consume his entire family. He was not the villain of this story. He was something that history is occasionally more uncomfortable with than it is with villains. A decent person, entirely in the wrong place, at the worst possible time. If Nicholas was the face of the last Romanov reign, Alexandra was its soul. Fervent, stubborn, deeply loving, and, depending on who you ask, a catastrophic influence on the machinery of empire. She had converted to Russian Orthodoxy with the sincerity of someone who does nothing halfway, embraced the mysticism of Russian religious life, and developed an unshakable conviction that God had selected Nicholas to rule, and that any advisor who suggested otherwise was a meddler at best and a traitor at worst. Alexandra was, in private, warm, funny, and a devoted mother who spent hours at her children's bedsides when they were ill. In public she was stiff, cold, and spectacularly bad at the kind of performance that ruling requires. The handshakes, the smiles, the careful management of the impression you make on people who will later decide whether to support you. Alexandra was born in a world of considerable warmth. Her grandmother was Queen Victoria, who adored her, and her early childhood in Hesse, though shadowed by the death of her mother when Alex was 6 years old, had been relatively normal by the standards of small German courts. But the death of her mother, and then the death of her younger sister May from diphtheria, left marks that never fully healed. She grew inward, grew serious, grew into a woman whose emotional world was intense, private, and not easily shared with people she had not explicitly decided to trust, which by the time she arrived in Russia was not a very long list. Russia, for its part, had expected something easier. The Russian court was a performance, an elaborate, exhausting, continuous performance of power, elegance, and national identity, and the Tsarina was expected to be its leading actress. Maria, Nicholas's mother, had played the role superbly. She danced, she charmed, she remembered names, she laughed at the right moments and was serious at the right moments, and made everyone in the room feel that the Romanovs were exactly what they claimed to be. Alexandra could do none of this. She approached state receptions with an expression that people read as haughty, and was in fact anxious, stood in receiving lines with a stiffness that looked like disdain, and was in fact the physical manifestation of a shy person being watched by hundreds of strangers. She blushed easily and deeply, which the court took as a sign of guilt rather than discomfort. She disliked the society of the aristocracy, which the aristocracy took personally. She was devout in a way that looked extreme even by the standards of Orthodox Russia. She prayed constantly, collected religious icons, sought out holy men, and this too was held against her, the excessive piety of a convert, always slightly suspect. And then Alexei was born, and Alexandra's world contracted further. Drawn into the radius of her son's illness, her terror for his life, and her increasingly desperate search for anything that might help him, the public duties she had always found draining became secondary. Alexei came first, then Nicholas, then her daughters, then God, and then, somewhere further down the list, the Russian Empire and its population of 130 million people. This was not selfishness exactly. It was a consuming, ferocious maternal love combined with a particular tunnel vision of a parent whose child might die at any moment. But it meant that the woman who might have compensated for Nicholas's political passivity with her own force of personality was instead turned entirely inward, and the empire ran without a Tsarina who understood what an empire required of her. Between 1895 and 1901, Alexandra gave birth to 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria and Anastasia, and each birth was received at court with a sympathy that probably felt a great deal like disappointment. Russia needed a male heir. The Romanov succession ran through the male line, and without a son the throne would pass to Nicholas's brother Mikhail, or further along the family tree to cousins whose suitability ranged from questionable to deeply alarming. The girls themselves were, by all surviving accounts, remarkably normal in the way only royalty locked inside a palace can be normal. They shared bedrooms, slept on hard camp beds by their own preference, performed small theatrical shows for their parents, corresponded endlessly with their extended family across Europe, and were shielded from the outside world so thoroughly that Anastasia, the youngest, reportedly once asked what a tram was. They were known collectively at court by the acronym OTMEA, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and functioned as a unit with the particular internal logic of siblings who have spent most of their lives in each other's company. Olga was the eldest and the most intellectually serious, prone to melancholy, interested in reading and poetry, and possessed of what people who knew her described as an almost painful sensitivity to the emotions of others. Tatiana was the organizer, the practical one, the one who managed logistics when management was needed, and who had, by all accounts, the kind of natural authority that her father conspicuously lacked. Maria was warm, sociable, the most conventionally pretty of the four, with a quality of open friendliness that charmed everyone she met, including, eventually, several of the guards who were supposed to be detaining her. And Anastasia was, well, Anastasia was the youngest, and she was also the funny one, the disruptive one, the one who slid down banisters and imitated the courtiers, and once, memorably, put on a show for the imperial family that was so elaborate and so aggressively performed that her tutor Pierre Gilliard noted it in his memoirs with a slightly dazed admiration of someone who has witnessed something they cannot quite categorize. The four girls were raised with the deliberate simplicity that their parents considered virtuous, and that was, in the context of the Russian court, genuinely unusual. They shared rooms until they were quite old, made their own beds, slept on camp beds because Alexandra believed too much comfort was bad for children, and were expected to be useful, to sew, to nurse, to be present at family occasions without making demands of their own. During the First World War, Olga and Tatiana trained as nurses, real nurses, not honorary ones, working alongside doctors in the hospital at Tsarskoye Selo, dealing with wounds and amputations and dying men, and both found it meaningful in a way that the rituals of court life had never been. What the diaries and letters make clear, reading them now, is that these were four specific, distinct, fully formed people, not props in a royal tragedy, but women with opinions and jokes and complicated feelings about their circumstances. Anastasia wrote letters full of drawings and misspellings and cheerful disregard for grammar. Olga worried about the future in language that is difficult to read in retrospect. Tatiana organized things right up until there was nothing left to organize. Maria, in the last months, apparently told one of the guards she hoped God would forgive everybody, everything that had happened. They were not symbols, they were people, and that is worth saying plainly, because history has a tendency to turn them into symbols, and symbols do not grow up wanting to know what a tram was. In August of 1904, Alexandra finally gave birth to a son. His name was Alexei Nikolaevich, and he was, by every visible measure, a healthy, cheerful, red-cheeked baby boy who delighted his parents and the entire court in equal measure. The celebrations were enormous, the prayers had been answered, the dynasty was secure, and then, a few weeks later, the baby began to bleed. Not an ordinary bruise, not the unremarkable bumps of infancy, but deep, alarming, unstoppable bleeding that would not clot, that turned minor injuries into terrifying episodes, that sent his mother into a state of anguished, sleepless terror from which she never fully recovered. Alexei had haemophilia, inherited through the female line from his great-grandmother Queen Victoria, passed silently through Alexandra, and landing with devastating precision in the one child the dynasty could least afford to lose. Haemophilia, specifically haemophilia B, as modern analysis of surviving biological material has confirmed, is a condition in which the blood lacks a specific clotting factor, meaning that injuries which would be trivial for most people become prolonged, agonizing, and potentially fatal for those who have it. In 1904, there was no treatment. There was no transfusion, no factor replacement therapy, no understanding of the underlying mechanism sufficient to intervene in any meaningful way. Doctors could watch, could try to minimize further injury, could advise bed rest and quiet, but they could not stop a bleed once it started, and they could not prevent the internal hemorrhages that accompanied even minor falls, the bleeding into the joints that caused swelling and pain of extraordinary intensity, the episodes that left Alexei screaming for hours while his parents sat helpless on either side of him and the court waited in the corridors outside. Alexandra carried the gene and did not know it. None of the girls were affected. They might carry the gene, might pass it to sons of their own, but they did not bleed. Only Alexei. And Alexandra, already a woman of intense religious conviction, interpreted this as something that required her to act, not medically, since medicine had nothing to offer, but spiritually, urgently, as a mother who would do anything. She prayed with an intensity that alarmed the people around her. She consulted holy men, sought blessings, collected relics, and she kept Alexei's condition secret, because the secrecy was not just dynastic pride, it was strategic. A haemophiliac heir could destabilize succession, invite challenges, provide ammunition to those who wished to argue that the Romanov line was compromised. The Russian people did not know. The court barely knew. The secret was maintained through years of cover stories and managed public appearances, and the strain of maintaining it fell primarily on Alexandra, who was already carrying more weight than any one person should reasonably be asked to carry. Alexei himself was, by all accounts, a child of considerable charm and considerable difficulty, in the way that beloved youngest children sometimes are, and in the additional way of a boy who has learned from infancy that the adults around him will do almost anything to prevent him from crying. He was funny, affectionate, curious, prone to mischief when his health permitted, and prone to terrible suffering when it did not. Sometimes bedridden for weeks, sometimes unable to walk, sometimes in pain so severe that even people who barely knew him found it difficult to describe without obvious distress. His parents treated him as simultaneously the most precious and the most fragile thing in their world, and the result was a boy who was deeply loved and, in certain respects, entirely unprepared for a life that was never going to proceed gently. He was 10 years old in 1914 when the war began. He was 13 in 1917 when everything ended. He never became whatever he might have been. That too is worth saying plainly. Into this atmosphere of royal anxiety, dynastic pressure, and a mother's frantic search for anything that might keep her son alive, walked Grigory Rasputin, mystic, peasant, self-styled holy man, and arguably the single most consequential bad decision in the history of the Romanov dynasty, which is saying something given the competition. Rasputin had arrived in St. Petersburg from Siberia and cultivated a reputation as a man of God with healing gifts, and in 1905 he was introduced to the imperial family at a moment of particular desperation regarding Alexei's condition. What happened in those sessions? Whether it was hypnosis, calm authority that stopped Alexei's anxiety-driven bleeding, or something else entirely, produced results that Alexandra found miraculous and clung to with a ferocity that would prove catastrophic. Rasputin was, by the accounts of people who met him, extraordinarily difficult to describe in neutral terms. He was tall, unkempt, with a beard that appeared to have been organised by committee and then abandoned, and eyes that contemporaries described variously as compelling, disturbing, luminous, and, in the case of at least one ambassador, deeply unsettling in a way he could not rationally account for. He had come to St. Petersburg with letters of introduction from bishops and abbots, who had been impressed by his piety and his apparent gifts, and he had made his way through the networks of the religious aristocracy, the women of good family who were drawn to mysticism and spiritual intensity, of whom there were rather a lot in the St. Petersburg of the early 20th century, before reaching the inner circle of the imperial court. His effect on Alexei, whatever its mechanism, was real enough to be documented by multiple witnesses. During the worst crises, the near-fatal hemorrhage at Spala in 1912, when the family was at a hunting lodge in Poland, and Alexei hovered between life and death for 11 days, while Alexandra barely slept, and Nicholas walked in the gardens unable to eat. Rasputin sent a telegram, Alexandra calmed, and the boy's bleeding appeared to ease. The doctors were baffled. Alexandra was confirmed. Nicholas, who was more sceptical than his wife about Rasputin's divine gifts, but deeply committed to whatever helped his son, allowed the relationship to continue. And the relationship continued and deepened and eventually became the thing that the entire court, the entire aristocracy, and eventually the entire country could not stop talking about. What Rasputin had, beyond whatever calming effect he produced on a frightened child and a frightened mother, was an absolute immunity to the social hierarchies that everyone else in the Russian court spent enormous energy navigating. He called the Tsar and Tsarina by the Russian familiar forms of their names. He ate with his hands at the imperial table. He dispensed advice with the confidence of someone who had decided that being a peasant mystic meant never having to pretend to be impressed by anyone. The court, which organised itself around the precise gradations of rank and precedence, found this both fascinating and appalling, in the way that things which violate all the rules tend to fascinate and appall the people whose identity depends on the rules being followed. He became the thing everyone talked about, the explanation for every decision they did not understand, the symbol of everything that was going wrong. And the more they whispered about him, the more Alexandra defended him, and the more she defended him, the more it looked like his influence was exactly as catastrophic as everyone said it was. While Alexandra saw in Rasputin a man sent by God to protect her son, the Russian court saw something considerably different, and what they saw caused a level of alarm that ranged from polite concern to full-scale aristocratic meltdown. Here was a rough-mannered, unwashed, barely literate Siberian peasant with a preacher's authority and a monk's reputation who had somehow acquired the personal trust of the Tsarina, dined with the royal family, and was increasingly rumoured to be advising Alexandra on matters of state. His behaviour at court was extraordinary, loud, familiar, prone to telling the nobility things they did not wish to hear, apparently impervious to the social hierarchies that everyone else spent enormous energy maintaining. Whispers began circulating that his relationship with Alexandra was something more than spiritual, which was almost certainly untrue and almost certainly did not matter, because once people started whispering it, the damage was done. The whispers had a structure to them that tells you more about the court than about Rasputin. The Russian aristocracy was an intensely status-conscious world in which every element of behaviour, how you bowed, who you addressed first, whether you sat before being invited to sit, carried meaning, and a man who violated those codes not through ignorance, but through apparent indifference was both incomprehensible and threatening. Rasputin did not bow to princes. He called Grand Duchesses by their first names. He told ministers they were fools directly and without apparent concern for the consequences. And because he did this while clearly enjoying the protection of the Tsarina, there was nothing anyone could do about it, which was the part that drove people absolutely to the edge of their considerable social composure. Reports were compiled and sent to Nicholas. These reports, written by the secret police, by ministers, by concerned members of the extended Romanov family, described Rasputin's behaviour in public. The drunken evenings, the boasting about his access to the imperial family, the women, the money that passed through his hands from petitioners who believed he could intercede with the Tsar on their behalf. Nicholas read the reports, looked uncomfortable, occasionally banished Rasputin from St. Petersburg for a period, and then allowed him to return when Alexandra made clear that Alexei needed him and that the reports were lies spread by Rasputin's enemies. This cycle repeated several times, each repetition reinforcing the general impression that the Tsar could not control his own household, which was doing nothing useful for his authority over the rest of the empire. What the court feared, and what the court was not entirely wrong to fear, was the signal that Rasputin's presence sent about the machinery of power. If the Tsarina was consulting a Siberian mystic about state affairs, and if the Tsar was deferring to the Tsarina, then the chain of decision-making that was supposed to run from God to Tsar to minister to implementation was broken somewhere near the top in a way that was very difficult to repair. Ministers found themselves unable to predict what decisions would be made or why. Advisors who offered sound counsel found it ignored in favour of whatever Rasputin had communicated to Alexandra in his latest letter. The court, which had spent 3 centuries organising itself around the absolute authority of the Romanov autocracy, discovered that absolute authority is only useful if it is being exercised by someone who knows what to do with it. In Rasputin, the accumulated weight of Russian royal mystique had somehow passed to a man who did not own a comb, and nobody could quite work out how to get it back. Before Rasputin had fully embedded himself in the palace, Russia offered Nicholas an earlier, somewhat gentler preview of what was coming. On the 22nd of January 1905, a date that would become known as Bloody Sunday, a peaceful march of workers and their families processed toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, carrying a petition for better wages and working conditions and bearing icons and portraits of the Tsar, because they genuinely believed Nicholas cared about them and would help if only he knew. Nicholas was not at the palace. Imperial troops opened fire. Somewhere between 100 and 1,000 people were killed, depending on the source. The effect on Russian public opinion was immediate and devastating. The idea that the Tsar was a benevolent father figure who simply did not know about the suffering of his people collapsed on that pavement in St. Petersburg, and it never fully recovered. The march had been organised by a priest named Father Georgy Gapon, which already tells you something about the particular character of Russian political life in 1905, that a workers' demonstration would be organised by a priest, that the workers would carry icons, that the petition being delivered was addressed to the Tsar personally, using the language of supplication rather than demand. The marchers were not revolutionaries. They were not Bolsheviks or Mensheviks, or members of any of the competing radical factions that were busy arguing about theory in European exile. They were factory workers and their wives and children, people who had been living through years of industrial expansion that had made certain people in St. Petersburg very rich, and had made the people doing the actual industrial work increasingly desperate, poorly housed, poorly paid, and poorly fed. They believed in the Tsar the way you believe in a parent, not because they had evidence he was watching out for them, but because the alternative, the idea that nobody at the top of the entire structure was watching out for them, was too bleak to contemplate on a January morning. Nicholas was at Tsarskoye Selo that day. The decision to fire on the crowd was not his directly. It was made by the military commanders on the ground, operating under standing orders about crowd control and the defence of imperial property, orders that nobody appears to have thought to revise in light of the fact that the crowd approaching the palace was carrying portraits of the Tsar and singing hymns. The mechanics of how a peaceful petition became a massacre are, on examination, a story about institutional rigidity, about a military trained to respond to threat without being trained to distinguish between a threat and a desperate request, and about a government so sealed off from its own population that it had no mechanism for receiving the message that was being delivered before the message became a crisis. What followed Bloody Sunday was a year of strikes, mutinies, uprisings and general chaos that came closer to ending the Romanov dynasty in 1905 than anything before 1917. The navy mutinied. The battleship Potemkin is the famous instance, though it was far from the only one. Workers across the industrial cities went on strike. Peasants attacked landowners. The professional classes, lawyers and doctors and teachers and engineers, organised themselves into unions and began making demands about constitutional government that would have seemed fantastical 5 years earlier. The empire appeared to be dissolving from multiple directions simultaneously, and Nicholas, at his desk, reading reports, going for walks, playing dominoes in the evenings, was trying to hold it together with a combination of concession and force that satisfied neither the people demanding change nor the people demanding he crush the whole thing immediately. The troops he sent to restore order did restore order, eventually, in the way that troops always restore order, when given enough time and sufficient authorization to be brutal about it. The strikes were broken. The mutinies were suppressed. The peasant uprisings were put down with a thoroughness that left lasting marks on the countryside and on the relationship between the Romanov state and its rural population. And the lesson Nicholas drew from 1905 was not that the system required fundamental reform, but that the system could survive a serious challenge if sufficient force was applied. He was not wrong exactly. He had survived. But what he had survived was a warning, and what he did with warnings was file them somewhere and continue playing dominoes, and the empire continued on its way toward a cliff that was still, in 1905, some distance ahead. The strikes, rebellions, and general chaos of 1905 eventually forced Nicholas into a concession he found genuinely agonizing: the October Manifesto, which promised Russia a constitution, civil liberties, and a legislative body called the Duma. For reformers it was a start, inadequate, grudging, but real. For radicals on the left it was a trick, a temporary bone thrown by a regime that had no intention of genuinely sharing power. For Nicholas himself, it was a humiliation he spent the next 12 years trying to quietly reverse. He agreed to the manifesto because his options had narrowed to essentially that or total collapse, and afterward he systematically undermined the Duma, rewrote the rules governing its power, and dismissed ministers who took constitutionalism too seriously, which is a governing strategy best described as lighting a fire and then being angry at the fire. The manifesto was written largely by Sergei Witte, Nicholas's most capable minister, and a man who had the particular exhausting quality of being right about most things in a court that did not especially want to hear most things. Witte had argued for years that Russia needed industrial modernization, institutional reform, and a government capable of absorbing political pressure through legitimate channels rather than simply suppressing it until the pressure exceeded the structure's capacity to contain it, which is a description of exactly what had just happened. Nicholas had resisted, deferred, and eventually, in October of 1905, with strikes shutting down the railways, the telegraph, and most of what constituted normal Russian civic life, agreed that Witte was probably correct, and signed the document that his grandfather Alexander II had spent 20 years considering, and his father Alexander III had refused to contemplate for a single afternoon. The Duma that resulted was, in theory, a legislative assembly with real power, the power to pass laws, to approve budgets, to question ministers. In practice, Nicholas almost immediately began working to ensure that it was none of those things. The fundamental laws of 1906, issued just before the First Duma convened, made clear that the Tsar retained supreme autocratic power, that the Duma could be dissolved at any time by imperial decree, and that its legislative authority was subject to veto. When the first Duma proved too liberal for Nicholas's comfort, he dissolved it. When the second Duma proved similarly inconvenient, he dissolved that too, and then rewrote the electoral laws to ensure the third Duma would be composed of a higher proportion of conservative landowners and a lower proportion of the kinds of people who asked uncomfortable questions about government policy, which is an approach to democratic representation best described as creative. The man he relied on to manage this period was Pyotr Stolypin, appointed Prime Minister in 1906, who was simultaneously the most effective statesman of the late Romanov period and a man whose methods of restoring order, mass executions of revolutionaries' deportations, the summary justice of the courts that became known as Stolypin's neckties, made him the most hated figure in Russian radical politics. Stolypin believed he could save the autocracy by reforming it from within, by creating a class of prosperous peasant landowners who would have a stake in stability and therefore resist revolution. He might have been right. He was assassinated in 1911, shot at the Kiev Opera House in front of Nicholas, who watched from the royal box as his most capable minister died in the stalls. And what replaced Stolypin was a succession of significantly less capable men operating in a political environment that was becoming, with each passing year, significantly less manageable. Nicholas attended the opera, read his reports, played tennis, and the empire continued its patient, steady journey toward everything that was coming next. One of the most genuinely baffling things about the final years of the Romanov dynasty is the degree to which family life at the Alexandra Palace continued in something approaching cheerful domesticity, even as the country outside the gates was moving in a direction that anyone paying attention could see was going to end badly. The children studied, performed amateur theatricals, tended a small garden, learned to knit during the war years, and squabbled over who had borrowed whose book. Nicholas took his daughters to play tennis. Alexandra organised charitable work. There were family movie nights. The Romanovs had their own film projector. There were pet animals and birthday parties and diary entries describing evening walks in the park, while a few hundred miles away, men were dying in their hundreds of thousands, in a war their government had entered for reasons that made less sense with every passing month. The Alexandra Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the name means Tsar's village, a piece of nomenclature that conveys the general spirit of the place, was set in a park of some 800 acres outside St. Petersburg, enclosed by walls, staffed by hundreds of servants, and designed in such a way that a family living inside it could, if they chose, have very little contact with the reality of the country surrounding it. The Romanovs did not choose this insularity deliberately, in the way of people who are hiding from something. They chose it in the way of people who have always lived inside a structure and have no framework for understanding that the structure is unusual. Tsarskoye Selo was normal to them. The servants, the rituals, the afternoon walks in the Imperial Park, this was simply what life was, and there was nothing in the daily texture of it that suggested the outside world was organised any differently. The children's rooms at the Alexandra Palace were, by the deliberate choice of their parents, relatively plain. The camp beds, the shared spaces, the absence of excessive luxury that Nicholas and Alexandra considered important for moral development. The girls embroidered, practiced piano, studied French and English, wrote diaries that survive and are, in the strange intimacy of historical documents, deeply human, full of crushes and jokes and complaints about lessons and observations about the weather. Alexei played with toy soldiers, conducted elaborate military games, pestered his tutors, and was carried on the shoulders of his devoted sailor attendant Nagorny when his legs would not carry him. The family played bezique and dominoes in the evenings. They watched films on their projector. American westerns were reportedly popular. They photographed each other constantly, using Kodak cameras, producing an archive of images that are both beautiful and, given what follows them, almost unbearable to look at for very long. What is striking, reading the diaries alongside the historical record is not that the family was oblivious. Nicholas received state papers, read reports, met with ministers who were telling him, with increasing urgency, that the situation was deteriorating. He knew, in the way that someone who reads summaries of documents knows things, that Russia was under stress. What he could not apparently do was translate that knowledge into a felt sense of emergency, a visceral understanding that the world outside the park gates was not an abstraction, but a collection of specific human beings whose suffering was building towards something that his tennis games and evening walks were not going to prevent. The insulation was not physical, it was psychological, the product of a lifetime of being the fixed point around which everything else orbited, the man to whom things were reported rather than the man who went to see them. And by the time the insulation failed, it failed all at once, and there was no gradual adjustment available. There was only the park, and then the revolution, with very little in between. In August of 1914, Russia entered the First World War on the side of France and Britain against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And if the Romanov dynasty had a single moment where everything that followed became, in retrospect, inevitable, this might be it. The war was catastrophically mismanaged from the beginning. Russian troops were sent to the front without adequate rifles, without ammunition, sometimes without boots, commanded by officers whose primary qualification was aristocratic birth rather than military competence, and supplied by a logistics system that managed to combine enormous distances with spectacular inefficiency. Casualty numbers climbed into the millions, villages emptied, bread prices rose, and Nicholas, in a decision that Alexandra advised strongly against, and that most of his ministers considered an act of political suicide, decided in 1915 to take personal command of the Russian armies at the front. Russia's entry into the war had followed the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, with the same logic that governed every other great power's entry, a chain of alliances, ultimatums, and mobilization timetables that had been designed to prevent war and managed instead to make it mechanically inevitable once the first pieces started moving. Russia was committed by treaty to defend Serbia. Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia. Germany had declared war on Russia in support of Austria-Hungary. And Nicholas, who had spent the preceding week sending telegrams to his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm in the hope that the two of them could sort things out personally, found himself at war with a man he'd been corresponding with in English and addressing as Willie, which is a detail that says everything you need to know about the surreal intimacy of the European royal family and its complete inability to control the forces it had set in motion. The early months of the war produced both catastrophe and brief, dizzying success in roughly equal measure, which was in some ways worse than consistent catastrophe, because it suggested the war might be winnable and prevented the honest assessment of how badly things were actually going. The invasion of East Prussia ended in the annihilation of two Russian armies at the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, combined casualties of over 300,000 men in the space of a few weeks. Simultaneously, Russian forces were making significant progress against Austria-Hungary and Galicia, capturing territory and prisoners at a rate that temporarily looked encouraging. The net result was a front that extended for hundreds of miles through terrain that Russia's supply system could not adequately service, a casualty rate that the country's manpower could not indefinitely sustain, and a military command structure that was, when examined closely, mostly decorative. Nicholas's decision to assume personal command in September of 1915 was, as his advisers told him with unusual unanimity, an act of extraordinary political recklessness. By placing himself at the head of the armies, he tied his personal prestige directly to the performance of those armies, meaning that every defeat was now personally his defeat, and every failure of supply or strategy was now attributable to the Tsar of all Russia, rather than to some general who could be conveniently replaced. His advisers presented him with a letter, signed by 8 ministers, arguing against the decision. Nicholas read it, thanked them politely, and went to the front anyway, because Alexandra thought it was the right thing to do, and because Nicholas, when Alexandra felt strongly about something, tended to feel strongly about it too, which is a marital dynamic that works excellently in private life, and somewhat less well when the question under discussion is who should command the largest army in the world. He left the government in Petrograd in her hands, and what happened next in Petrograd will require its own chapter, because it deserves one. With Nicholas at the front, Alexandra remained in Petrograd. St. Petersburg had been renamed in 1914 because Petersburg sounded too German, and found herself essentially running the government. This was not an arrangement anyone had designed or desired, but it was what the situation produced, and Alexandra approached it with the conviction of a woman who believes absolutely in her husband, her god, and her Siberian mystic. Ministers came and went at a pace that alarmed everyone watching. Some dismissed because Rasputin had advised it, others because Alexandra had concluded they were insufficiently loyal to the autocratic principle. In the space of roughly a year and a half, Russia cycled through 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, and 3 foreign ministers, which is the governmental equivalent of trying to steer a ship by replacing the captain every 3 weeks. Alexandra's letters to Nicholas at the front are extraordinary documents, long, daily, written in English, full of love and anxiety and domestic detail and political advice. And reading them is one of those historical experiences that is simultaneously intimate and genuinely alarming. She wrote to him about Alexei's health, about the girls' lessons, about the weather at Tsarskoye Selo, and then, in the same paragraph, about which minister should be dismissed and what Rasputin had said about the military situation, and why Nicholas should resist whatever his generals were recommending. Because his generals did not understand Russia the way she and their friend, her consistent term for Rasputin, understood Russia. Nicholas wrote back with equal regularity, equally loving, equally domestic, and exhibited in his replies the same quality he had always exhibited. He agreed with whoever he had spoken to most recently, and most recently he had spoken to Alexandra. Rasputin's actual influence on policy is a question historians continue to argue about, and the honest answer is that it was probably less systematic and more episodic than contemporaries believed. He was consulted. His opinions were conveyed to Nicholas through Alexandra, and some of those opinions coincided with decisions that were made. But the perception of his influence was itself a political fact of the first order, because perception shapes behaviour, and the behaviour of ministers who believed they might be dismissed on the word of a Siberian mystic was very different from the behaviour of ministers who believed their tenure depended on competence and results. Ministers began consulting Rasputin directly, lobbying him for support, bringing him gifts and petitions, which meant that the informal power he had accumulated through Alexandra's trust was now being reinforced by the official class's decision to treat him as a node of actual authority. The system organised itself around his influence, and in doing so, made his influence real. The letters Alexandra sent during this period, urging Nicholas to be firm, to dismiss this minister, to resist that policy, to trust Rasputin's judgment on matters ranging from military appointments to railway policy, reveal a woman of fierce conviction, acting entirely in good faith on a set of beliefs that were, taken individually, reasonable, that the Tsar should be strong, that the autocracy should be defended, that those who undermined it were traitors rather than critics, that divine guidance was available through prayer and holy men if you were sufficiently open to it. The tragedy is not that Alexandra was malicious. The tragedy is that she was completely sincere, completely certain, and completely wrong in ways that she had no mechanism for discovering, because the structure of her life had never required her to be accountable to anyone who could tell her so. Nicholas read her letters, replied warmly, and largely did as she suggested. The ministers cycled through. The war continued, and Petrograd, watching all of this from the outside, began to draw its own conclusions about what was happening inside the palace walls. By December of 1916, the situation had deteriorated to the point where a group of aristocrats, including the Tsar's own cousin and a man named Felix Yusupov, who was probably the wealthiest private individual in Russia, concluded that the only way to save the monarchy was to kill the man they believed was destroying it. The murder of Rasputin has been so heavily mythologized that it is difficult to separate fact from the dramatic legend that accumulated almost immediately. But the core of it is this: he was lured to Yusupov's palace on the night of the 16th of December, 1916, and he died there, though the exact sequence of events remains disputed. What is not disputed is that his death did not produce the results his killers expected. Alexandra was devastated, Nicholas was appalled, and the dynasty Rasputin had supposedly been ruining continued to ruin itself at exactly the same pace, just with fewer people to blame. Felix Yusupov was 29 years old, fabulously rich, enormously well-connected, and possessed of the particular quality of a man who has never been told no by anyone, and has therefore developed an exaggerated faith in his own ability to manage situations. He and his co-conspirators, who included the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a member of the extended Romanov family, and Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing politician who had recently delivered a speech in the Duma denouncing Rasputin as a catastrophe for the empire, had concluded that removing Rasputin would restore the Tsar's judgment, clarify Alexandra's thinking, and allow the monarchy to regroup around a more coherent governing strategy. This was the reasoning of people who had correctly identified one symptom of a systemic crisis, and incorrectly concluded that removing the symptom would cure the disease. The legend of Rasputin's murder, the poisoned cakes he supposedly ate without effect, the wine he supposedly drank without dying, the multiple shooting, the final drowning, has been repeated so many times and in so many versions that it is now essentially impossible to reconstruct with confidence. Later forensic analysis of the available evidence suggests the reality was considerably less operatic than the version Yusupov told in his memoirs. Rasputin was probably shot and died relatively quickly, without the supernatural resilience that the legend attributes to him. The details were embellished almost certainly by men who needed their crime to feel like something more than murder, like the defeat of a monster, like a dramatic act of political salvation, rather than a group of aristocrats shooting a man in a basement and then driving his body to a river in the middle of the night. When his body was found in the Neva, the reaction of the city was not horror, but something closer to relief, which tells you a great deal about how far Rasputin's reputation had spread beyond the palace gates, and how thoroughly he had become the explanation for everything that was wrong. Nicholas and Alexandra had his body buried on the grounds of Tsarskoye Selo with quiet ceremony, and Alexandra grieved with an intensity that confirmed everything the court had suspected about the nature of the relationship, whether or not those suspicions had any basis in reality. The conspirators were punished, mildly. Dmitry was sent to Persia. Yusupov was exiled to his estates, because the Romanov family had been involved, and Nicholas could not bring himself to do what the law technically required. Rasputin was gone. The ministers were still cycling. The war was still going. The bread was still short. And in Petrograd it was the middle of winter, and the lines outside the bakeries were very long, and the women standing in them were very cold, and they had been standing in lines like this for a very long time, and they were just about done. The Russian Revolution of February 1917, which, due to the calendar Russia was using at the time, actually took place in early March by Western reckoning, was not organised by a revolutionary party, not planned by Lenin, not masterminded by the Bolsheviks. It happened because the bread ran out. Women standing in lines outside bakeries in Petrograd, in bitter winter cold, after years of war and rising prices and dead husbands and missing sons, simply stopped waiting and started marching. Workers joined them, then more workers, then soldiers sent to disperse them decided not to, and then decided to join them instead, which is the point at which revolutions stop being riots and become something else entirely. Within days, 300 years of Romanov rule had effectively ended, and Nicholas, at his military headquarters several hundred miles away, was still receiving reports that the situation was manageable. The bread shortage was real. It was not a perception or a political grievance that could be addressed with a manifesto. It was a physical absence of flour in a city of 2.5 million people in the middle of February. The war had disrupted grain distribution, pulled horses and men from agriculture, and produced the particular compound crisis in which the country that grew enough food to feed itself could not get that food to the cities because the railway system was overwhelmed, carrying military supplies to a front that was itself consuming men and materials at a rate that made any calculation of sustainable duration an exercise in dark comedy. The bread lines had been growing for months, the ration cards were insufficient, and the women of Petrograd, who had been holding households together through years of absence and shortage and grief, while their government cycled through ministers and consulted mystics, woke up on the 23rd of February, which happened to be International Women's Day, and decided that they were no longer willing to stand in a line and wait. What began as a demonstration by perhaps 90,000 people on the first day grew to 200,000 on the second and effectively encompassed the entire city by the third, as workers from the industrial districts of the Vyborg side joined the marching women, and the energy of the street shifted from hungry frustration to something more focused and more dangerous. The Cossacks sent to disperse the crowds declined to charge. The soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, many of them new recruits who had more in common with the people in the street than with the officers commanding them, began to mutiny. By the 27th of February, the 12th of March by Western reckoning, the garrison had effectively gone over to the revolution, and the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies was forming in the Taurid Palace, while in another wing of the same building, the Duma was trying to construct a provisional government to fill the vacuum that was opening with extraordinary speed. Nicholas received increasingly alarming telegrams at his military headquarters at Mogilev, and responded by ordering the commander of the Petrograd military district to restore order, which was the kind of order that requires troops and troops that will follow orders, and the Petrograd garrison was demonstrably no longer in that category. He then decided to travel back to Petrograd by train, a journey that railway workers promptly ensured he could not complete by the direct route, and then by any route, as the trains were stopped and redirected. And Nicholas sat in a railway carriage watching the situation reports accumulate, and discovering that the empire he had ruled for 22 years had dissolved in the space of about 5 days while he was reading them. On the 2nd of March, 1917, Nicholas II signed his abdication, handing the Russian throne to his brother Mikhail, who declined it the following day, effectively ending the Romanov dynasty in the space of about 48 hours. The abdication itself was, by surviving accounts, eerily calm. Nicholas signed the document in a railway carriage, showed little visible emotion, and then went to his diary and wrote what might be the most understated entry in royal history. He described the moment briefly, noted that he had signed, and then recorded that he had read a book that evening. There was no rage, no weeping, no dramatic last stand. Observers who had expected the autocrat of all Russia to fight for his throne found instead a quiet, tired man who seemed almost relieved to put down a burden he had never entirely wanted. The generals made the abdication happen. This is worth pausing on because the story of February 1917 is often told as a revolution from below, and it was genuinely a spontaneous popular uprising that the regime could not suppress. But the mechanism by which Nicholas actually left power was the quiet withdrawal of support by the military commanders he depended on, men who had spent the preceding days assessing the situation in Petrograd and concluded that the dynasty was finished and that the least damaging outcome available was a clean abdication, rather than a prolonged and probably losing attempt to restore order by force. Nicholas telegraphed his front commanders asking for their assessment. They replied, one after another, that abdication was necessary. Even those who had been personally loyal, personally close, saw no alternative. The autocracy of all Russia ended not with a battle, but with a survey of generals who had decided the mathematics no longer worked. Nicholas had originally signed the abdication in favour of his son Alexei, with Mikhail as regent, which was the constitutionally tidiest arrangement and the one that preserved at least the theoretical continuation of the dynasty. Then he reconsidered. Alexei was 13 years, old and chronically ill, and Nicholas could not face the prospect of handing his sick child to a regency government that might, in the name of political convenience, take the boy away from his parents permanently. He signed a revised document abdicating on behalf of both himself and Alexei, passing the throne to Mikhail. Mikhail, who had not been consulted and who was not a man of strong political appetite, spent the following morning in conversation with leaders of the provisional government, concluded that accepting the throne would require an impossible guarantee of personal safety, and declined. The dynasty had run out of Romanovs willing to be Tsar, which is a sentence that would have been incomprehensible a week earlier. Nicholas returned to Tsarskoye Selo as a private citizen, moving through stations where crowds had gathered and flags were flying, and the portraits of the Tsar that had hung in every public building were being systematically taken down. He arrived at the palace to find his family. Alexandra had not been told immediately, and was still managing the children's measles with the focused energy of a woman who copes with catastrophe by doing the next necessary practical thing. They were together again. They were prisoners. And the empire that had organised 300 years of Russian history around the question of what the Tsar wanted had moved on to other questions, most of which were considerably harder, and none of which had obvious answers. After the abdication, the family was confined to the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo under house arrest, and what followed was a period that reads, in the diaries and letters that survive, as something between a long, tense holiday and a slow-motion catastrophe. They gardened. Nicholas sawed wood. The children put on plays. Tutors continued lessons. They walked the grounds, supervised by guards who were sometimes respectful and sometimes actively hostile, depending on the political winds. The girls contracted measles, their hair fell out, and they photographed each other looking like newly shorn sheep and laughed about it. Friends sent parcels. Supporters wrote letters promising rescue. And around them, the provisional government tried to hold together a country that was running out of patience, food, and soldiers at roughly equal speed. The transition from Tsar to prisoner happened with a speed that was disorienting for everyone, including the guards. The soldiers assigned to watch the family in the first weeks were drawn from the Petrograd garrison, and were operating without a clear framework. They had been told to confine the family to the palace grounds, to prevent correspondence with the outside world, and to maintain security. But the specific texture of how you guard a man who was, 3 weeks ago, the autocrat of all Russia had not been fully worked out in advance. The result was an uneasy improvisation in which some guards were formal and distant, some were openly hostile, some were sympathetic in ways that went beyond what their political commitments probably sanctioned, and a few struck up genuine if awkward conversations with the family, particularly with the girls, who were 17, 20, 21 and 22 years old, and were managing the situation with a combination of resilience and good humour that visitors consistently found remarkable. Nicholas adapted with the same equanimity he had brought to everything, which is a quality that is either admirable or maddening depending on how you feel about equanimity as a response to catastrophe. He established a routine, early rising physical exercise, sawing wood in the park, which he found both useful and satisfying, lessons with the children, evening reading, diary entries. He read widely and voraciously during the Tsarskoye Selo months, histories, biographies, novels, military memoirs. He had always been a reader, and confinement gave him time that the demands of state had previously denied. He wrote in his diary about the weather, about the books he was finishing, about the quality of the wood sawing, about walks in the park with the children, in language that gives almost no indication that the man writing was aware he might be running out of time. Alexandra struggled more visibly. She had always drawn her strength from the conviction that Nicholas's autocracy was divinely ordained, and that opposition to it was, at a fundamental level, sinful, a position that was theologically coherent and practically catastrophic once the autocracy had been removed. Without the framework that gave her world its meaning, she found the confinement harder, found the guards' hostility more difficult to absorb, found the uncertainty about their future more corrosive than Nicholas's apparent calm suggested he found it. She prayed constantly. She wrote letters, fewer now that correspondence was monitored. She sat with Alexei when his joints swelled, held his hand through the bad nights, and continued the vigil that had been the central activity of her life since 1904. The family was together, in a palace that was still beautiful even surrounded by armed guards, and for a period that lasted 5 months, that was what their life was. In April of 1917, Vladimir Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd in a sealed train arranged by the German government, which had calculated correctly, as it turned out, that getting Lenin into Russia would accelerate that country's exit from the war. Lenin stepped onto Russian soil with a clear, simple and radical program: immediate peace, land to the peasants, power to the Soviets, and absolutely no cooperation with the provisional government or its liberal dreams of parliamentary democracy. The provisional government responded by continuing to fight a war nobody wanted and failing to address the land question that had been festering for generations, which is a governing strategy best described as reading the room and then acting as though you had not. Lenin had spent the preceding years in European exile, Geneva, Paris, Zurich, writing theoretical texts, conducting internal party debates with the ferocity of a man who considered ideological precision a matter of life and death, which in his case it more or less was, and waiting. He was a man built for waiting, or rather, a man built for the moment after waiting ends, someone whose clarity of purpose and absolute certainty about what needed to be done was genuinely extraordinary by any standard, and was either inspiring or terrifying depending on which side of his program you found yourself on. The German government put him on a sealed train, sealed to prevent contact with German citizens, lest his political ideas infect them on the way through, and sent him across Europe and into Finland and then into Russia, a decision that the German High Command considered a form of biological warfare, the introduction of a revolutionary organism into the body politic of an enemy state. They were not wrong about the effect. The April theses, which Lenin announced to his own party members the day after his arrival, stunned even committed Bolsheviks. No support for the provisional government, no participation in the bourgeois democratic process, immediate peace, land redistribution now, Soviet power immediately. The Bolshevik leadership in Petrograd had been, before Lenin's return, operating in a fairly moderate mode, supporting the provisional government cautiously, participating in the Soviets, treating the revolution as something to be consolidated through institutional channels. Lenin's return ended that in a single speech. He was, by all accounts, an electrifying public speaker despite an unprepossessing physical appearance. Short, broad-headed, gesticulating emphatically, with a delivery that somehow made absolute certainty feel like reasonable analysis rather than fanaticism. What Lenin understood, and what the provisional government consistently failed to understand, was that 1917 Russia was not a society capable of patient institutional development. It was a society at the end of its tolerance for war, for hunger, for promises of future improvement offered by governments that had been promising future improvement for a very long time. The provisional government's commitment to continuing the war, partly out of genuine belief in the Allied cause, partly out of fear of what Germany would demand in a separate peace, partly out of the not unreasonable calculation that a revolutionary government that immediately surrendered would lose all international credibility, was politically fatal. Every month the war continued was another month of casualties and bread shortages and radicalization of the soldiers and workers whose support the government needed to survive. Lenin offered an immediate end to everything that was making people's lives unbearable. The provisional government offered up a continuation of the same with the promise that it would be better organized. Russia, in 1917, was not in a mood for better organization. It was in a mood for Lenin, and Lenin was ready for it. In August of 1917, the provisional government, alarmed by the gathering radicalism of Russian politics, and worried about the family's safety in a city growing more volatile by the week, transferred the Romanovs to Tobolsk in Siberia, not a prison, technically, but a remote and comfortable enough governor's house in a provincial town where the family would be safely out of the way of whatever was coming next. The journey east was, by the accounts of those who made it, almost pleasant. Long train rides through the Russian countryside, meals in the dining car, the children playing cards. Tobolsk itself was quiet, cold and deeply boring, which after the years of palace pressure was not entirely unwelcome. Nicholas chopped wood. The children organised theatricals. Alexandra prayed. And slowly, in October happened. The decision to move the family had been made by Alexander Kerensky, the dominant figure of the provisional government in its later months, a man of considerable oratory and considerably less political judgment, who was trying to manage a revolution he could neither control nor reverse. Kerensky was not unsympathetic to the Romanovs. He had met Nicholas during the initial house arrest and found him, as almost everyone found him on personal acquaintance, quietly likeable. But he was governing a country whose political temperature was rising daily, and whose radical elements would have been very happy to put the former Tsar on trial in Petrograd. Moving the family east was, in his calculation, the safest solution for everyone, including the Romanovs, and he was probably right about that, though what followed suggests that safety was a relative and temporary concept in 1917 Russia. The town of Tobolsk was, in 1817, a significant administrative centre of western Siberia. In 1917 it was a quiet provincial backwater of perhaps 20,000 people, largely untouched by the industrial radicalism of the cities and governed by a conservative population that included a significant number of people who still thought of the Tsar with something approaching reverence. The family was housed in the former governor's mansion, a substantial two-storey house that was comfortable without being palatial, staffed by reduced but still functional household staff, and surrounded by a wooden fence that defined the limits of the world they were now permitted to inhabit. Beyond the fence was the town, and beyond the town was Siberia, and beyond Siberia was everything that was happening in the rest of Russia, arriving in the form of increasingly alarming newspaper reports that Nicholas read with his characteristic equanimity, and Alexandra read with her characteristic dread. Life in Tobolsk settled into a routine that was, by the standards of what was coming, almost peaceful. The children studied. Gilead, their French tutor, continued lessons with a conscientiousness that is either admirable or heartbreaking, depending on how you read it. Nicholas read Tolstoy, histories, military memoirs, the newspaper, and chopped wood, a physical activity he had always found satisfying, and which presumably took on additional meaning when the thing you were splitting was a log rather than a country. Alexandra's health was declining, her heart giving her trouble, and she spent increasing amounts of time resting, writing in her diary, and corresponding with the handful of loyal friends who were still sending letters. Alexei had a bad fall and injured his ankle badly enough to confine him to bed for weeks, the hemorrhage into the joint producing the prolonged pain and swelling that the family had spent 13 years learning to manage without letting it show. The guards at Tobolsk were initially drawn from a relatively sympathetic regiment, and the early months of the confinement were, by the accounts of the household staff who left memoirs, tolerable. Then October happened, and the Bolsheviks were in power, and the guards who had been tolerable began to be replaced by guards who were not, and the newspapers brought news of a peace treaty with Germany that Nicholas considered a national humiliation, and the world outside the fence was reorganizing itself into a shape that had no place for any of them, and the chopping of wood continued, and the lessons continued, and the distance between Tobolsk and what was coming closed, slowly and then all at once, like winter. On the 25th of October, 1917, the 7th of November by the Western calendar, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd in a coup that was, by the dramatic standards of Russian history, surprisingly undramatic. The Winter Palace was taken with minimal resistance. The provisional government essentially dissolved. Lenin announced Soviet power with the calm of a man who'd been planning this for 20 years, because he had. The effect on the Romanovs, far away in Tobolsk, was gradual and unmistakable. Guards became less deferential, allowances were cut, small humiliations accumulated. The butter ration was reduced. Nicholas was forbidden from wearing his epaulets. Coffee was served without cream. These were not accidental oversights. They were the architecture of diminishment, the careful, deliberate stripping away of everything that had once signalled rank. The storming of the Winter Palace, which Soviet mythology would later render as a heroic assault by thousands of revolutionary workers, was in reality a somewhat chaotic nighttime operation involving a relatively small number of Red Guards and sailors entering a building defended by a few hundred cadets and a women's battalion, some of whom had given up and gone home before the main action began. The provisional government ministers inside were arrested without violence. Kerensky escaped in a car borrowed from the American embassy, wearing a disguise, and left Russia, which is the kind of exit that tells you everything about the solidity of the government he had been leading. Lenin announced the transfer of power to the Soviets from the Smolny Institute in language that combined theoretical precision with the specific rhetorical energy of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time and is not going to waste it on understatement. What the Bolshevik seizure of power meant in practice was different in different places. In Petrograd and Moscow it meant Red Guards and commissars, and the immediate reorganization of the institutions of government under Bolshevik control, a process that was rapid, ruthless, and accompanied by the closing of opposition newspapers, the arrest of political rivals, and the dismantling of the mechanisms of liberal democracy that the provisional government had been attempting to establish. In the rest of Russia it meant something more uncertain, a central government claiming authority it did not yet possess over a country that had spent 8 months in revolution and was nowhere near finished. The civil war that would consume the next 3 years was already implicit in the geography of it. The Bolsheviks held the cities. Enormous stretches of the country did not yet know or did not yet accept that they were now living under Soviet power. In Tobolsk, The news arrived by newspaper and by the changing behaviour of the guards. The soldiers assigned to watch the Romanovs held their own committee meetings, a revolutionary practice that had spread through the military and which produced in Tobolsk a guard contingent that became progressively less willing to follow the orders of its officers and progressively more interested in asserting its own authority over the prisoners. Small things changed first. The forms of address shifted. The guards who had been formerly respectful became casually hostile. Access to the town was restricted further. The allowance that the provisional government had been providing for the family's upkeep was reduced, then delayed, then reduced again, and the household staff began quietly selling silverware to supplement the budget. Nicholas's epaulettes, the military insignia that had marked his rank for his entire adult life, were removed by order of the Guards Committee, and Nicholas accepted this without visible emotion, which his captors apparently found unsatisfying, as though they had been hoping for a reaction that would give them something to work with. One of the questions that has occupied historians ever since is why nobody saved them, and the honest answer is that several people tried, several governments considered it, and none of them tried hard enough or at the right moment. Britain, through King George V, who was Nicholas's first cousin, and who resembled him so closely that the two men were sometimes photographed side by side as a party trick, initially offered asylum in March of 1917, then quietly withdrew the offer when the British government concluded that harbouring the former Tsar would be politically inconvenient. Germany made various calculations. Sweden considered various routes. White Russian officers planned rescue attempts that fell through or arrived too late. Around the Romanovs, the world was full of people who felt sympathy, made plans and found reasons not to follow through, which is a pattern as old as political expedients. The British offer and its withdrawal is the episode that has generated the most sustained historical attention because George V and Nicholas were not merely cousins. They were close, corresponding regularly, and sufficiently physically similar that photographs of the two men together look like one person, experimenting with different hats. George had been genuinely fond of Nicholas, and the initial British offer of asylum made in mid-March of 1917 and communicated through diplomatic channels to the provisional government was apparently sincere. Then the British government had second thoughts. Lloyd George's cabinet was concerned about the domestic political reaction to offering a comfortable English refuge to the man who'd been running an autocracy while British workers were dying in the trenches for democracy. They were concerned about the signal it would send to the Russian provisional government, whose continued participation in the war Britain needed urgently. They were concerned about a dozen other things that were more immediately pressing than the fate of one family, and they quietly let the offer lapse, and George V, who may or may not have pushed harder than he did, said nothing publicly that would record his position with any useful clarity. There were individuals who tried. A monarchist officer named Boris Solovyov, who had, with extraordinary timing, married Rasputin's daughter, presented himself in Tobolsk claiming to represent a rescue network, and collected money and jewellery from loyal supporters to fund an escape operation. The network appears to have been either incompetent or fraudulent, possibly both, and nothing came of it. Other officers made plans that required coordination, financing, and a degree of organisational capacity that the White movement in its early stages did not reliably possess. The geography was genuinely difficult. Tobolsk was remote. The distances were enormous, and moving a family of 7+ household staff through hostile territory while the country was sliding into civil war was not a simple logistical proposition. None of this excuses the failure. It explains the texture of it. What the world's failure to act reflects more than anything else is the speed with which the Romanovs ceased to be useful. While Nicholas was Tsar, every government in Europe had a position on Russia, and therefore a position on him. Once he was a private citizen under house arrest, he became a political liability for anyone who might help him, evidence of counter-revolutionary sympathy, a provocation to the Bolsheviks, a complication in the urgent business of ending a war that was still consuming men and treasure at an unsustainable rate. The world had other things to manage, and the Romanovs were, by the calculus of 1917 and 18, a problem whose solution could be deferred, and then deferred again, until deferral was no longer a meaningful concept. In April of 1918, the Bolshevik government, increasingly alarmed by the advancing armies of the anti-Bolshevik white forces and the possibility of a Romanov rescue, transferred Nicholas, Alexandra, and their daughter Maria from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, a strongly Bolshevik city where the local Soviet could be trusted to keep them under firm control. The house they were taken to, the Ipatiev house, belonging to a merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev, who had been given about 2 hours to vacate, was renamed the House of Special Purpose by their captors, which is the kind of name that, when you hear it, you understand immediately what it means. The windows were painted over with lime. The fence was raised. The guards, drawn from a unit loyal to the local Bolshevik leadership, were armed, hostile, and instructed to prevent all contact between the prisoners and the outside world. The transfer from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg was itself an event of considerable anxiety, and not only for the family. The Ural Soviet had been pressing Moscow for months for custody of the Romanovs, arguing that the Tobolsk arrangement was inadequate and that a White Army advance could put them within range of a rescue attempt. Moscow agreed, with some reluctance. There were people in the central Bolshevik leadership who still harboured the idea of a public trial, a legal proceeding that would demonstrate the crimes of the old regime to the world, while disposing of Nicholas in a manner that could claim legitimacy. The Ural Soviet was less interested in legitimacy than in security, and security, in their understanding of the word, meant Yekaterinburg, which had been one of the most solidly revolutionary cities in Russia since 1905, and which could be trusted not to allow sentiment to complicate the situation. Nicholas, Alexandra and Maria made the journey first, travelling by train under heavy guard through a Russia that was now openly at war with itself. The civil war between the Red Army and the assorted white forces had begun in earnest, and the train passed through a landscape reorganising itself along military lines. The other children followed separately a few weeks later, when Alexei had recovered sufficiently from his injured ankle to travel, arriving to find their parents already installed in a house that was considerably less comfortable than even the reduced circumstances of Tobolsk. The Ipatiev house was a 2-story merchant's house of no particular distinction, requisitioned, fenced, and stripped of most of the qualities that make a house habitable for people rather than prisoners. The family's rooms were small. Nicholas and Alexandra shared one room. The girls shared another. Alexei had a small room of his own. The windows that had been painted over with lime let in a diffuse grey light that gave the rooms the quality of a space that exists outside of time, neither day nor night, neither inside nor outside, sealed off from the world in a way that felt less like protection and more like erasure. The guards were present at all hours, entering the rooms without knocking, monitoring meal times, controlling movement with a totality that Tsarskoye Selo's house arrest had not quite achieved. The family was not permitted to walk in the yard unobserved, not permitted to receive visitors, not permitted to know with any reliability what was happening in the war outside, which was the question on which their survival most directly depended, and about which their captors had every reason to keep them uninformed. Life inside the Ipatiev house in those last weeks was a study in claustrophobia, enforced by lime-washed windows and hostile guards who understood very well that their prisoners were nobody anymore. The family shared cramped rooms, slept on the floor in the final weeks when their beds were taken, and were subjected to a series of petty humiliations. Guards who drew obscene pictures on the walls, who did not knock before entering, who helped themselves to food from the family's increasingly limited stores. Nicholas recorded daily temperatures in his diary, noted walks in the yard, observed the weather, catalogued small transactions with the same meticulous detachment with which he had documented his entire life. Alexandra's health was declining. She spent much of her time in a wheelchair. Alexei was carried everywhere. The girls, by all surviving accounts, remained remarkable, practical, uncomplaining, funny in the way that people are funny when the alternative is despair. The guards at Yekaterinburg were not the relatively sympathetic soldiers of Tsarskoye Selo, or even the ideologically straightforward hostility of the later Tobolsk guards. They were younger, harder, more directly shaped by the specific culture of revolutionary Yekaterinburg, and they operated under a commandant, a man named Alexander Avdeyev, later replaced by Yakov Yurovsky, who set the tone of the household. Avdeyev's regime was characterized by deliberate small cruelties. Food was served late, served poorly, served in insufficient quantity. Personal items disappeared from the family's rooms without explanation. Letters addressed to the family were intercepted. The yard access that provided the family's only direct sunlight and fresh air was limited to specified windows of time, then shortened, then interrupted unpredictably. None of this was random. It was the systematic application of pressure to people who could not respond to pressure in any useful way. And it had the particular quality of cruelty that comes not from sadism, but from ideology, from the genuine conviction that these people represented everything that had been wrong with Russia, and that treating them with ordinary human consideration would be a form of political error. The family adapted in the ways available to them. They prayed together, morning and evening, with the particular intensity of people for whom prayer is not ritual but conversation. The girls kneeling on the bare floor, Alexei propped in his chair, Nicholas and Alexandra side by side with the closeness they had maintained through 23 years of marriage and whatever it had cost them. They read, Nicholas working through the books he had brought from Tobolsk, the girls sharing whatever materials were available. They talked, in the particular way of people who have been together in a confined space for a long time, and have developed the conversational shorthand that comes from it, references that needed no explanation, jokes whose setups everyone already knew. Tatiana cut Alexei's hair. Maria sketched in a notebook. Anastasia, who had always been the family's comic relief, reportedly kept it up in Yekaterinburg, kept finding things to laugh about, kept manufacturing the lightness that the situation did everything to extinguish. Yurovsky replaced Avdeyev in early July and was, by every account, considerably more efficient and considerably more frightening, a Bolshevik true believer of the organized methodical variety who ran the Ipatiev house, with a precision that the family probably recognized, on some level, as a change in kind rather than degree. The outdoor walks were stopped entirely in the final weeks. A second fence was constructed, blocking the view of the street. Contact with the outside world, already minimal, became non-existent. The White Army's guns could be heard in the distance, and in the silence of the lime-washed rooms, the family listened to them and tried to calculate what they meant. The decision of what to do with the Romanovs was not, historians largely agree, made in Yekaterinburg. It was made in Moscow, at the highest levels of the Bolshevik leadership, though the documentary trail has been contested and obscured for decades. The advancing White Army was getting closer to Yekaterinburg. A rescue of the former Tsar, however unlikely, would hand the counter-revolution a figurehead that could prove dangerous. Lenin and Sverdlov, the head of the Soviet executive, communicated with the local Ural Soviet, and somewhere in that communication, the exact nature of which is still debated, a decision was reached. The family was not going to be moved. They were not going to be tried in the public spectacle Lenin had once considered. They were going to be executed quietly in the basement of the Ipatiev house, on a night when the White Army was close enough that the sound of their guns could be heard in the city. The question of how directly Lenin ordered the executions is one that Soviet archives, partially opened after 1991, have illuminated without fully resolving. What the available evidence suggests is that the decision was made at the central level, that Moscow gave the Ural Soviet authorization rather than the Ural Soviet acting unilaterally, but the precise chain of communication remains obscured by decades of Soviet-era destruction and concealment of relevant documents, combined with the self-interested memoirs of the surviving participants, none of whom had obvious reasons to record their role with full candour. The Ural Soviet had been pressing Moscow for authorization to execute the family since at least June of 1918, arguing that the military situation made continued detention dangerous and that the risk of rescue was real. Moscow had been temporizing, still weighing the option of a trial, still calculating the international reaction, still uncertain about what disposing of the former Tsar would mean for the Bolshevik government's relationship with the wider world. What ended the temporizing was the military situation. The Czech Legion, a force of Czechoslovak prisoners of war who had been fighting their way east across Russia in an attempt to reach Vladivostok, and from there the Western Front, had joined with White Army forces and was advancing toward Yekaterinburg with a speed that the local Bolshevik command found alarming. The city would fall, it fell, in fact, on the 25th of July, 8 days after the executions, and if the family was still in the Ipatiev house when it fell, the counter-revolution would have the symbol it needed. A living Nicholas, even a Nicholas who had abdicated, who had signed no counter-revolutionary proclamations and shown no interest in reclaiming his throne, was politically dangerous simply by existing. A trial, which Lenin had genuinely considered, would require time and security that the military situation could not guarantee. The Ural Soviets' argument prevailed. Yurovsky received his orders, planned the operation with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything he did, and on the evening of the 16th of July, assembled the small team that would carry out what the official record would initially describe as an execution of Nicholas alone, conducted to prevent his rescue. The rest, that the entire family and their remaining servants had been killed simultaneously, would not be officially acknowledged for decades. The decision had been made. The family in the Ipatiev house did not know it. The White Army's guns continued their distant percussion through the Ural night, and in the lime-washed rooms the family prepared for sleep, and Yurovsky made his preparations, and the night moved forward. In the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918, the Romanovs and their remaining servants were woken and told to dress. The story they were given was that they needed to move to a safer location because of unrest in the city. They were asked to gather in the basement for photographs, the official explanation being that the Soviet needed a photograph to prove the family was safe, a request that, in retrospect, is either the cruelest lie or the most absurd bureaucratic instinct in history. Alexei, who could barely walk, was carried down by Nicholas. Alexandra requested chairs. The family arranged themselves and the guards filed in, and Yakov Yurovsky, the local Cheka commander who had been placed in charge of the operation, read a short statement. It was over in minutes, though not cleanly. The execution was chaotic, prolonged and terrible, a fact that the dry language of the historical record softens considerably. The family woke without apparent alarm, which tells you something about the particular quality of hope that even in the Ipatiev house, in the final weeks of their confinement, the possibility that each day might be their last had not fully displaced the ordinary human expectation of the next morning. They dressed. The servants who remained, the family physician Dr. Botkin, the cook Karitonov, a housemaid named Demidova, and a footman named Trupp dressed also. They were led downstairs through a series of corridors to a semi-basement room, a room with a single barred window and walls of plastered brick, the kind of room that would be a storage space in an ordinary house, which is what it had been before the Ipatiev house became the house of special purpose. Alexandra asked for chairs, there being no furniture in the room, and 2 chairs were brought, one for her, one for Alexei, who was having difficulty standing. The rest of the family arranged themselves in a rough line. Nicholas stood at the front, holding Alexei. The girls stood together. The 4 servants ranged themselves along the side wall. It was approximately 2 in the morning. Yurovsky entered with the execution squad and read from a paper. The Ural Soviet had condemned them to death. Nicholas said, or is reported to have said, "The accounts of what happened in the next moments vary in their details, having been reconstructed from the memories of traumatized participants. What? And then the shooting began. What happened next was chaotic in a way that the historical record, however sanitized, cannot entirely conceal. The girls did not die immediately. They had sewn jewellery into their clothing, into the fabric of their corsets and dresses, in the months of confinement, and the gemstones deflected bullets. Demidova, the housemaid, survived the initial volley and was pursued around the room. The smoke was dense. The noise was contained by the basement walls. It lasted, by various estimates, somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes, and at the end of it all 11 people in the room were dead, and the guards carried the bodies out, and loaded them into a truck and drove into the Ural forest, and the house of special purpose stood empty in the early morning of the 17th of July, 1918, and the White Army's guns continued their approach, and Yekaterinburg fell 8 days later, and the room in the basement was found with its bullet holes in the walls and its blood stains in the plaster, and nothing else remaining. The Bolsheviks spent the better part of the following 70 years neither confirming nor denying what had happened in Yekaterinburg, maintaining for decades that only Nicholas had been executed, and that the family had been dispersed to various locations, a lie that gave rise to an entire ecosystem of impostors, most famously a woman named Anna Anderson, who claimed for decades to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia, and convinced a remarkable number of people, including several members of the European aristocracy, who really should have known better. The bodies of the Romanovs were buried in a makeshift grave in the forest outside Yekaterinburg, moved once to a different location when the original site seemed too easily discoverable, and did not come to light until 1979, when a Soviet filmmaker named Geli Ryabov found them, and then reburied them quietly because the political climate of the Soviet Union was not exactly hospitable to that particular revelation. The disposal of the bodies was, like the execution itself, an operation that combined ideological determination with practical incompetence in ways that would, eventually, make the cover-up impossible to maintain permanently. Yurovsky's own account, written later and discovered in the archives after the Soviet Union's collapse, describes the sequence of events in the forest outside Yekaterinburg in the days following the execution, with the clinical detachment of a man filing a report about a logistical problem, which is apparently how he experienced it. The first burial site was deemed inadequate. A second site was selected. The bodies were partially burned, treated with sulfuric acid in an attempt at destruction that was more thorough in intent than execution, and buried in 2 separate locations, 9 of the 11 in one grave, 2, Alexei and one of the girls, identified by later forensic analysis as Maria, in a separate, smaller grave some distance away. The decision to separate the burials appears to have been partly practical and partly an additional precaution against discovery, the logic being that a search that found one grave might not find both, and incomplete remains might generate enough uncertainty to complicate identification. It did generate uncertainty for decades, and the uncertainty was useful to the Soviet state, which found in the official ambiguity about the family's fate a way to neither confirm their deaths which would require acknowledging the full scope of what had been done, nor deny them in a way that would encourage the impostor industry that was flourishing in European exile communities regardless. The bodies remained in the forest for 61 years. Ryabov, who found them in 1979 using Yurovsky's account as a guide, was a filmmaker and Bolshevik history enthusiast who had been conducting his search quietly for years. When he opened the grave and confirmed what he had found, he took photographs, removed 3 skulls briefly as evidence, and then, recognizing that what he had discovered was politically explosive in a Soviet Union that was not remotely ready to engage with it, replaced the skulls, reburied everything, and waited. He published a brief account in a Soviet magazine in 1989 in the more permissive atmosphere of Glasnost, and the official excavation of the site followed in 1991. The world had waited 73 years for confirmation of what many had assumed since 1918. The graves, when properly excavated, contained exactly what Ryabov had found, and the long silence of the forest outside Yekaterinburg was finally, irrevocably broken. The story of Anastasia, or rather, the story of the idea of Anastasia, became one of the 20th century's most persistent and genuinely remarkable pieces of mythology, the kind that persists because it wants to be true even after the evidence has made it very clear that it is not. Anna Anderson appeared in Berlin in the 1920s, claiming to be the youngest Romanov daughter, and the ensuing legal battle over her identity lasted, with various interruptions, from 1938 to 1970, the longest legal proceedings in German history. She had an extraordinary amount of detailed knowledge about life at the Russian court, an explanation for which ranged from genuine memory to extensive research to coaching by people with various agendas. DNA testing in 1994 settled the question definitively. She was Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker, and Anastasia was in the grave outside Yekaterinburg with the rest of her family. Anna Anderson was found on a bridge in Berlin in February of 1920, having apparently attempted suicide, and was taken to a psychiatric hospital where, after a period of refusing to identify herself, she began to claim that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia, survivor of the Yekaterinburg massacre. She was convincing enough, or the desire to believe her was strong enough, that she attracted the attention of serious figures in the Romanov diaspora, including members of the extended family who had known the real Anastasia and who came away from meetings with Anderson divided in their opinions, some convinced, some firmly sceptical, all unable to produce the kind of definitive evidence that would settle the question in either direction. The legal case that eventually ran for 32 years was an attempt to establish her identity in a German court for the purpose of claiming the estate of a German relative of the Romanovs, and the reason it lasted as long as it did was that the evidence was genuinely ambiguous in the ways that matter to courts. She knew things, that was the core of it. She knew details about life at the Russian court that were obscure enough not to be available in the published memoirs and newspaper accounts that anyone might have read. Small personal details, family habits, the layout of private rooms. Some of this knowledge she might have acquired through research or through coaching by monarchist supporters who had access to information from surviving members of the household. Some of it was harder to explain by those means. She also failed to know things she should have known. Her Russian was poor, her German was fluent, and she could not or would not consistently answer questions in ways that matched what people who had actually known Anastasia remembered about her. The survivors of the imperial household who met her were split. Gilead, the tutor who had known the girls for years and had genuine insight into their personalities, was certain she was a fraud. Others were not certain at all. What Anna Anderson offered, beyond the specific question of identity, was a story the world wanted, that at least one of them had escaped, that the basement in Yekaterinburg was not the end of everything, that the 4 girls who had been photographed in their white dresses in the Alexander Palace Park had not all died there in the dark before the summer was over. The story was taken up by films and novels and plays and continues to circulate in popular culture in forms that bear almost no relationship to the historical reality. Anastasia did not escape. None of them escaped. The DNA confirmed it. The forensic anthropology confirmed it. The excavation of the second grave in 2007, which produced the remains of Alexei and the girl buried separately from the others, confirmed it completely and finally. They are all accounted for. The myth, however, has a life of its own, and myths rarely consult the forensic record before deciding what to believe. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the Russian government acknowledged officially what the historical record had established decades earlier. The entire Romanov family had been executed in Yekaterinburg in July of 1918. Their remains were exhumed, identified through DNA analysis, and buried in a state funeral in St. Petersburg in 1998, 80 years after their deaths, in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, where Russian Tsars had been buried for 2 centuries. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas and his family as passion bearers, not martyrs in the political sense, but saints in the sense of those who faced death with Christian resignation in the year 2000, which generated roughly the amount of controversy you might expect from the sanctification of an autocrat. What they left behind is contested territory. Dynasty, 3 centuries of Russian history, 4 million square miles of empire, and a family photograph album full of girls in white dresses squinting into the summer sun. The funeral in 1998 was itself a complicated event, attended by President Boris Yeltsin, who had not been expected to come and came anyway and spoke briefly and appeared genuinely moved, and not attended by Patriarch Alexei II of the Russian Orthodox Church, who had doubts about the official identification of the remains that kept him in Moscow while the coffins were carried into the cathedral. The debate about the remains, whether they were definitively, scientifically, certainly the Romanovs, continued even after DNA testing had established their identity beyond reasonable scientific doubt, because the question was not really a scientific one. It was a question about what Russia was going to do with its own history, and Russia in 1998 was still working that out, and has arguably not finished working it out since. What Nicholas left behind as a ruler is a record that even sympathetic historians find difficult to rehabilitate. The Russo-Japanese War, which Russia lost and which he had largely blundered into. Bloody Sunday and its aftermath. The failures of 1905 and the systematic undermining of the constitutional reforms that emerged from it. The decision to enter the First World War without adequate preparation, to take personal command without adequate ability, to leave the government in the hands of his wife and through her of Rasputin, while millions of his subjects died in the fields of Galicia and the Masurian lakes and the other landscapes of European catastrophe. These are not small failures. They are the failures of a man who held absolute power over 130 million people and exercised it with the decisive force of someone who found decisiveness genuinely difficult. And yet. There is also the family photograph album, the real one, the one in the archives, full of images of 5 children growing up in a world they did not choose, swimming in the Finnish skerries, playing with their dogs in the palace park, making faces at each other at the camera in the way that siblings have always made faces at each other, regardless of who their father was. There is Nicholas holding Alexei on his shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. There is Alexandra in the Levadia Gardens, looking for once not rigid and anxious but simply warm, a woman in the sun with her children nearby. There is Anastasia in a tree grinning. There is Olga, older, looking at the camera with an expression that suggests she knows more than she is saying, which she probably did. They were a family, specific and irreducible, and they died in a basement in Yekaterinburg in the middle of July 1918, and the summer continued without them. and Russia continued without them, and the century continued without them, and here we are. So tonight, you have travelled a long way. You have walked the marble corridors of the Winter Palace and the quieter rooms of the Alexander Palace. You have sat in the railway carriage where a man signed away 300 years of dynasty and then read a book. You have stood in the lime-washed basement of a house that no longer exists. It was demolished in 1977 on the orders of a regional Communist Party official named Boris Yeltsin, who would later stand at the graveside of the people whose death that house contained and appear, by every account, genuinely sorry. History has a sense of irony that no novelist would dare attempt. What do you do with a story like this one? It is not a story that resolves cleanly into a lesson. Nicholas was not a monster, and the dynasty did not fall because of one man's failings, though his failings were real and consequential, and cost an uncountable number of people their lives. It fell because 300 years of autocracy had produced a structure so rigid it could not bend, and a country so vast and so unequal that the distance between the people at the top and the people at the bottom had become, by 1917, a distance too large for any amount of good intentions to cross. The revolution that followed was not kind, and the Soviet Union that emerged from it produced its own catastrophes on a scale that makes the failures of the Romanovs look modest by comparison. History rarely trades one set of problems for a clean slate. It trades them for a different set, and the people caught in the middle pay the price either way. But the children are the part that stays with you if you let it. 4 girls and a boy who did not choose any of it, did not choose the palace, did not choose the dynasty, did not choose the haemophilia, or the mystic, or the war, or the basement, who grew up sharing rooms and making each other laugh, and writing in their diaries about the weather and the books they were reading and the dogs they loved and the future they were, right up until the end, still somehow imagining. Olga's poetry, Tatiana's organisational instincts, directed at the end toward keeping the family's spirits up in a house with painted-over windows. Maria's warmth extended even to the guards who were supposed to be her jailers. Anastasia in a tree, grinning. They were stubborn in the way that young people are stubborn about the future. They kept expecting one, right up until they didn't have one anymore. And there is something in that stubbornness that is worth honouring, not because it saved them, because it did not, but because it is the truest thing about them. They were alive, fully and specifically alive, and they faced what came for them with more grace than most of us will ever be called upon to display. So tonight, as you settle into your bed, your safe, warm bed, in a house with windows that let in the light, in a world where the things that threaten you are most likely the ordinary manageable things, maybe carry them with you for a moment. Not with pity, because they would not have wanted that. With something quieter. With the recognition that history is not made of forces and systems and ideological currents, though it is made of those things too. It is made of people. Specific, irreducible, photographable people who loved their dogs and argued about books and hoped, against considerable evidence, for one more ordinary morning. The Romanovs are gone. The house is gone. The empire is gone. But the photographs remain, and the diaries remain, and the girls in their white dresses remain, squinting into the summer sun of a world that was about to change in ways none of them could see coming. Sleep well. The morning is yours,